You are now muted.
Okay, this talk is titled Beyond Learning to Code, How Tech Learning Collective Merges IT Training with Emancipatory Political Action. And will be presented by members of the Tech Learning Collective, an apprenticeship-based technology school for radical learners. Founded and operated exclusively by radical queer and femme technologists, they offer undergraduate and low-cost computer classes on topics ranging from fundamental computer literacy to hacking techniques. Describe their holistic approach to IT education, which is creating communities of activist sysadmins out of people who wouldn't otherwise have called themselves techies, opening the world of free people who apply its advances to their other liberatory goals. Turn it over to Tees.
Thanks so much for that intro. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our talk. If you have any trouble just hearing, obviously just throw that into the IRC chat room, and our wonderful tech team from FSF is going to help us out. I am representing Tech Learning Collective today. I want to talk a little bit about why we're doing what we're doing and why we're doing what we're doing in the way that we're doing it, and why that might be different than what you might expect. This talk is called Beyond Learning to Code, in large part because one of the things that's unique about Tech Learning Collective is that we don't really teach coding per se. We teach a lot of IT infrastructure, and that this, of course, overlaps with learning to code, but it's not the same thing. And so likewise, if you have any questions, please throw those into the chat as you have them. And I hope that by the end of this, what I want to leave you with is a different way of thinking about what would be useful to do today in your personal life as an individual, or as someone who is maybe part of an affinity group, part of a small community group, small neighborhood group, small PTA group, small education group, small club, something on a scale that is sort of more immediate to your personal life, that that will materially impact and improve the situations that you find yourself in and the situation that you find your loved ones in. That's sort of really where our focus lies. And so to start that conversation off, I kind of want to just begin this notion of talking about why care about technology in the first place, right? There's a lot of people who have technology interests for many, many different reasons. There's fun hobbies and curiosity, right? Just kind of like casual interest. There's a lot of people who need to care about technology for their livelihood, right? It's part of their job, part of their work, something that they feel is going to help them become more capable than they currently are. So there's individual capability, right? And then, of course, there's that Silicon Valley slogan, right? Make the world a better place. It has this sort of utopic vision of all the things that can be improved with better technology. And if we just have the right tools, everything will be fine and wonderful. And so we like to say that this is sort of the techno-capitalist view of how things are happening, right? Most people, right, in Silicon Valley like to say that they're making the world a better place. It's literally a TV show, right, that you can watch, a Mike Judge production, Silicon Valley, that jokes about this throughout 5 very, very incredibly ridiculous seasons. What Silicon Valley and tech companies tend to actually be doing, though, in our view, right, is making it possible for individuals to get a job. And that's fine. There's nothing particularly wrong with that. It's just that it's not really what they claim to be doing largely. Of course, what most people, and I don't mean to suggest that most people here, but I mean most people writ large in the world, right, want to do with technology in large part is that it's a curiosity. We're not necessarily sure what to do with technology. It's just that there's some cool things and it's of interest. So it can be a fun weekend project. And how many times have you had someone, or know of someone perhaps who bought a Raspberry Pi for a weekend project, but then never really got around to the weekend project? You know what I mean? So all these things are really happening to some degree or another, but it's important to sort of identify what people think that they're doing, not just what they say that they are doing. In contrast, right, our sort of view of the same thing is this is sort of what we actually aim to do, is make the world an actually better place. And again, this is why I started by talking about what does that mean with respect to your personal life, right? That's a place to start that is a little bit more understandable than the larger scale of the whole world. It is also true that if you come through to TLC, Tech Learning Collective, right, you will gain capabilities that you might not have had before, because you will be exposed to technologies that you might not have seen. You will have an opportunity to learn from mentors and people with some more experience than perhaps you have about technologies that you don't necessarily know as much about. And that can, of course, result in, for example, getting a job or other things. But for us, that's also part and parcel of the community aspect to it. So we at TLC, right, find technology fun in and of itself, but we find it primarily useful as a medium to do something else. In other words, we're less interested in optimizing our database queries to the nanosecond level, right, than we are in having a database, because what that means is a materially different reality for someone regarding what they would like to do than if they didn't have that same capability that technology provides. So that's why we care about it. So we have these two primary missions at TLC, TLC being the technology school, right? One is to simply provide meaningful technology education to underserved communities. And in brief, what we mean by that is that in a grandiose vision, we do not believe that a humane society should require you to do any kind of labor for the privilege of having a livelihood in all the ways that I mean that word. You should not have to work to be able to have food. If that work is for somebody else, right? You should have an autonomous life, free to make your own choices in all the ways that freedom means. And that means, at a grand scale, it means that we are working towards, hopefully, seeing a world where we can abolish the idea of employment as a prerequisite for survival in the first place. It also means, of course, that that's a pretty far off vision. And we're not, unrealistic about how far away that necessarily is. And so right now, right, by necessity and perhaps at an individual level, it means that we want to try to enable this immediate material improvement in people's lives, students' lives in our case, and of course the lives of the people who are involved in their communities. Importantly, that means that we have to do this in a way that doesn't rely or require the cooperation of existing capital, like large companies, like state and local regulators, because those are institutions primarily born from a status quo. And obviously, abolishing employment is a radical departure from the status quo. And so what that means is we have to, survive in a world where the status quo is not aligned with our goals. So we have to not require or rely on that work. The other primary goal for TLC, the secondary objective, right, is to fund existing community-owned technology projects that are built and maintained and implemented, right, for radical social good. And what we mean by that is that we want to materially support. So that means either with money or with hardware or with people's skill and time, the projects that are doing the political work that we find valuable. So this is, for example, hardware, right, as I said, for physical infrastructure installations. I can talk a little bit about some examples of that later on. The operating costs, right, from proceeds of workshops and courses that we teach. And then, of course, we're trying to do this in a way where we're also able to survive in the existing system, which means that we're trying to avoid the construction through our process of any kind of exploitative volunteering arrangements, and which means that everyone who is involved in a serious time-committed way is being paid for their time when they are involved in TLC. That means teachers and marketing staff and so on and so forth. So those are sort of the two primary goals there. And this can kind of all be summed up, right, by this idea that there is a lot of work that needs to be done to, right, parentheses, make the world a better place. But most of that work cannot be done, quote, at work, right? You cannot change the world in the 30 minutes that you have for lunch. So that's sort of that's the challenge. In a super zoomed out view, this is kind of where we see this happening. This is kind of how we see the potential for change starting. This is called what we call the Tech Learning Collective flywheel. Ironically enough, this is actually a business concept invented or at least popularized by Jeff Bezos of Amazon. And the idea is simply that there is a value, right, that we offer that we can feed into other values that already exist elsewhere, that once we take advantage of, we can continue to feed into this circular process that starts this so-called flywheel effect that, while it takes a lot of energy to sort of begin to make this happen, once the flywheel is moving, its own momentum continues the process of getting things further and further along. So in our case, right, in the case of TLC, we are a school. We use free software, right? And in using free software, right, it means that we can offer the same things as a lot of other schools with lower financial costs, but it also means that we enable our students to do things with a lot lower financial costs. It also means that we potentially have more accessible tools, right? In both cases, that combination drives student enrollment, just drives engagement with our courses and course and material, which means that, of course, we can create more courses and workshops from that and feed that back into TLC, which again is then supportive of, both as users and in some cases as contributors to some free software projects, which then drives lower financial costs and onwards, right? But it also means that we have this opportunity after creating an alumni network and a set of folks who have a shared baseline understanding of the technology that we're using, right, to construct and to offer, right, hyperlocal infrastructure projects and other community work, benefits of how, for example, right, they can do the things that they want to see done, that they can advocate for their own goals. What that means is that we can create political impact, right, from a grassroots level, which of course will also be using and supporting the free software movement, which means that we've got lower financial costs to drive student engagements, to drive workshops, to get more hyperlocal infrastructure projects, and onwards and onwards. And so this, in a nutshell, right, is basically the 10,000-foot vision of why we think that starting from an infrastructure school, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in just a minute, rather than a coding school, we can actually enable this in a way that if we start on the other side, like a coding school, right, you end up actually supporting a status quo instead of resisting it. So let's dig into this a little bit more, right? Like, what are the viable components that we're talking about here? First of all, you have at TLC a bunch of these things called practice labs. I mean, this is not a super big surprise. Anytime that you're learning something, you're going to want to play around with it hands-on, perhaps, right? And so for us, what that means is that we build it on GNU+Linux. We build it on repeatable infrastructure that we can create as infrastructure as code. Two examples of that are, locally installed VirtualBox, use Vagrant to automate it. These are DevOps tools primarily used in the industry for development operations, right, style work, but we use it for education. We also, of course, have our own infrastructure, primarily built as IAC, which in some cases we share with other groups who want to do something similar. Primarily, this means Ansible, Terraform. We also host internal services, primarily over Onion services, to collaborate internally. So we have our own sort of internal calendars running free software implementations, CalDev servers, basically. We have some file servers, again, all behind Onion services, actually authenticated Onion services in most cases, because we can use IAC, infrastructure as code, to automate a lot of the processes around adding or removing members and giving them appropriate access permissions and so on and so forth. The hyperlocal infrastructure projects I mentioned, just very briefly, right? We were started in about 2015 or so in New York City, sort of got a boost after the November 2016 election for reasons. The core group of us sort of dispersed into a number of other projects around New York City, primarily at the time. And what that means, right, is that we now have connections to these hyperlocal infrastructure projects or other sort of groups that are doing things in and around New York City. And again, this sort of comes back to that alumni community and that flywheel effect, right? So what they're doing can then feed into other groups and so on and so forth. From there, right, as alumni share visions with one another, and they experience this sort of alternate approach to empowering technologies, then we create more possibility for mentors, which creates more possibility for apprentices, and then onwards to that effect. Hope that makes sense. So when considering a school, right, there are a lot of ways one can go about learning, because the whole point of a school is a place to learn, right? And so the model that we take here is that we are not trying to be the be-all and end-all of everything. We are trying to be one of several options. Here's a couple ways of thinking about what those options are. We have this sort of infographic here where goal-oriented is on one axis, and the opposite of that is exploratory. Unstructured versus guided is the other axis. And the idea here is that we are sort of both goal-oriented and guided, right? So what we are kind of competing against, but more just trying to be an alternative to, I should say, is a bootcamp or university model of education, which is the other sort of goal-oriented and guided approach to learning a lot of technology things that you probably have seen: computer science courses, Turing School, Flatiron General Assembly, code bootcamp, that kind of stuff, right? We're not really trying to be an alternative to things like hackfests and social clubs and read Wikipedia articles and stuff. We think those are great and wonderful ways to learn if you have the sort of personality for it. But for a lot of people, goal-oriented and guided learning is both familiar and also into a lot of respect, right, is sort of the thing that they would like to spend their time on, especially synchronous time, right, when you're with a human as well. So if we can zoom in on that a little bit, like what makes us different than, for example, the bootcamp and the university model. And to talk about that, I'd like to sort of introduce this idea, right, where we have here this sort of trapezoidal shape, where this is how we think about learning. Here are all the possible things that you can learn, right? And at the very base of this trapezoid, we have these concepts, these foundational pieces of understanding that sort of are relevant regardless of which specific technology you use, right? Above that, we have competencies, which are skills with specific tools or familiarity with a shared culture in those tools. And you have, of course, capabilities, which are these higher level abilities to do things with those skills. And this sort of runs the gamut between things that can be fun for hobbies, right, all the way through to mutual aid and political activism. And in the middle there's this sort of like individualistic, idea of like, well, I need to get a job. And this is not, again, this is not an all-encompassing view. This is an example. So let's fill this area, right, with things that we learn at TLC. And so if we start with just filling in some of the concepts that we talk about, right, you'll notice that there are some things that are probably very familiar to a lot of, highly technical people, right? There are things like the physical networking of the OSI layer, of the OSI model of internetworking, right? There are things like, for example, censorship and anti-censorship, right? Circumvention tools, anonymity, privacy, right? But there's also stuff like, for example, hypermedia and nonlinear writing, right? Which is, we think, a concept foundational to, for example, the internet and the web in particular, the hyperlink, right? That isn't exactly teaching about the web. There were things that predated HTML, for example, that discussed hypermedia and nonlinear writing that are useful to know about that are not necessarily taught if you go to, for example, a code bootcamp that immediately introduces you to the next, the newest version of the Rails framework, as an example. And all of this stuff is what we consider, right, the foundational pieces of the things that we're learning. And we really take a lot of time and focus on making sure that these things are discussed as first-class citizens, if you will, of a curriculum. So from there, once you understand that these things are things that you can learn, right, you can start utilizing specific tools and technologies to implement your understanding of these things. So for example, cloud APIs, right, or HTML and CSS and JavaScript, or GPG and password managers, and how to use virtualization and the command line and gnu+linux and infrastructure and all this sort of stuff, right? We don't really necessarily have too much of a puritanical view per se of like what you should do here. We care more about here. And the reason for this, right, is because if you understand hypermedia and nonlinear writing, then you have a much better approach, or you have a much better way of approaching any single one of these things. Git, for example, right, is sort of a nonlinear way of writing a history about a project. But HTML has links, which is sort of the introduction to like wikis, which is, both of these are sort of ways to do nonlinear things. That makes sense. And then, of course, once you have some skill in one or more or several of these technologies, right, then you can actually do meaningful things in your life, like share or explore or publish or collaborate or advocate, right, or be a leader, create some self-direction. And finally, of course, act collectively with others who also have similar skills and visions and appropriate views about how they are imbuing the acts that they take with the values that they have. So if you look at this sort of way that we approach this curriculum building idea, right, and you compare this with, for example, right, like, for example, a code bootcamp, or like, for example, university course, most of which are trying to get you to, be employable, what you see is that there's a much larger vision about what it is a student needs and what supports a student needs in a guided and goal-directed way to actually accomplish those larger things than a code bootcamp actually provides, right? That smaller trapezoid is where the code bootcamp focuses its energy. And you can see that we as Tech Learning Collective, right, have started from a much more foundational place and have ended up with a much broader view of what's possible for students because we started out at that much more foundational place. So just as another comparison, right, the other part of it is price. I know someone right now who's trying to engage with a code bootcamp, and unfortunately they want to but can't because it's just too expensive. In their case, it's even more expensive than this. And this is what's shown on the slide, about $1,400. This is data based on the sampling of CourseReport.com's best bootcamps for 2020. In contrast, Tech Learning Collective courses, if you're taking a course, right, is literally an order of magnitude less expensive. It's like And if you take standalone workshops for just particular things, right, like that's even less expensive. So part of the point here is that this comes back to that flywheel where the things that we're doing and the way that we're doing it allows us to do stuff in a much less expensive way that will provide a lot more accessibility to a lot more people. This is, of course, particularly important for women who are bearing the brunt of, for example, child caring requirements or things during the pandemic. And all that shit that rolls downhill. Excuse me. The other thing that's unique about us is that we started this as a political project, not a school, and so we were very, very mindful from the get-go about like who are we teaching and what do they want to do with what we're teaching. And what that sort of has resulted in is an approach that has, as you can see from this slightly now dated internal survey, is that we end up getting a lot more repeat students. In other words, people who come to one workshop and then a second and then third and the fourth and so on, right? Who are on the sort of like femme of center spectrum in the gender identity than the masculine of center sort of side of that spectrum. And this is, as for the industry at large, is kind of unheard of. For a school in particular, also kind of unheard of, which we're very proud about. The other thing that's different, right, is that we provide this through an apprenticeship-based learning experience rather than a sort of rote memorization or like task-based learning experience. And what that means is that the people who are teaching are actually expert teachers, not just expert subject matter, like not just experts on the subject matter that they are teaching. For us, what that means is that every TLC instructor was a TLC student in the past, right? And on top of that, that every TLC instructor is actively involved, right, in the other projects that TLC is sort of like a sister organization about. It also means that the teachers themselves, right, are doing this in a particular style. It is not a lecture approach. It is not a sit and watch the presentation, unlike actually what we're doing right now where you have slides, right? In classes, it's really live, so that there are no recorded, pre-recorded materials. Everything is live in that screen share, or that sharing of a terminal together. And what that means is that you're actually doing a lot more kinetic things than you would otherwise. The other thing that's different is that we try to learn together, right? So you learn from experts, but you learn together after the fact and with that expert. And so what that means is that we have this sort of series of ways of getting more and more involved in the school that starts with maybe just a public workshop, but that can continue through, for instance, a set of a sequence, like a curated sequence of classes that we call cohorts, that is what make up a particular run of a course. And then once you have sort of gone through that run of a course, right, the next step, if you want to continue being engaged with, is, for example, the alumni learning community, where there are a bunch of clubs and other groups that have dispersed out of Tech Learning Collective's sort of baseline course material. And so that both gives people an on-ramp that sort of like lets them dive as deeply as they want, but not deeper. And that means that they can much more quickly move from learning about something technical to doing the thing that they want in the physical world, or in the real world, in the political impact, in the political sphere even, based on what it is that they want to do. So this is sort of like, I want to leave a lot of time for discussion, because I realize this is maybe a larger issue, but I wanted to just sort of highlight some things that some students have said about TLC so far. And I just want to sort of point at those sort of differences, right? Like, so one student, Chantel, who was a computer science undergrad, right, says that the amount I'm learning in Tech Learning Collective workshops is way more than what I was learning in my college classroom. And the reason I want to highlight this is because this is in combination with the fact that Tech Learning Collective workshops and courses are shorter. In other words, you spend less time in TLC classes, but you still end up learning way more than you might in, for example, a university course, or, for example, a code bootcamp. The other thing I want to highlight is someone named Snow, who said, this class was immensely valuable, right? And this is the big point, changed my core beliefs about my technological proficiency and potential. And what I want to highlight in this is this idea that a lot of people who would otherwise be very involved with these sorts of technologies, just for personal projects, just for things that they want to see done in the world, aren't, not because we need, for example, necessarily better tools and better documentation, although of course we do need all these things, everything can be made better all the time, but rather because they have, through whether it be systemic impacts caused by inequalities out in the world, or just sort of preconceived notions about maybe earlier technologies that they've encountered, right, this belief about themselves that an environment that is more social, that is more supportive, that is more apprenticeship-based, as we say, right, actually changes how they view themselves in that world, and that makes it more possible for them to do all those things that we talked about, that we want to see people, change, lead, and collaborate, and share, and explore, and all that sort of stuff. So that is getting this feedback is really, really meaningful to us. And so again, back to this, right? Back to this flywheel. For us right now, right, through primarily necessarily individual impact because of where we are in this process, we are trying to do this by offering the sort of alternative to the rush to employment, right, way of learning about technology. Where, for example, right now, if you go to a lot of code boot camps, you are almost introduced to the technology as though the current technology is the beginning of history for that technology. There's not really a lot of discussion, right, about where terms came from, what the history was of a given technology, right, why that's important. And for us, right, starting that way gives you a narrative that you can then see yourself not necessarily as simply memorizing a bunch of facts or learning a bunch of sort of like standard operating procedures for how to actually take, a command line and then end up with a website. But it lets you create in your mind almost a story, right, of what happened before you arrived, what's going on now. And importantly, because it's a story and you have now the tools to write the next chapter, you can actually understand where you've come from, understand how you fit into what's happening now, understand the forces that are at play in, for example, the job market, or in, for example, just the free software movement generally, and then have the capability, right, of taking that metaphorical pen and defining what you want to see as the next chapter about it. And so that's it for my presentation part. I would love to see questions. I have a lot of things I could say about this, but I wanted to distill this down to just those main ideas, because I'm really hoping that this is at least intriguing to some people. And I'm sure that I probably didn't cover everything, almost intentionally. And so if you have questions, that would be a great time to sort of let me know about what you're more curious about, what you want to hear more about. And then the rest of this can really just be, right, talk and discussion.
Yeah, so we have a little over 15 minutes left.
Great.
We have some really great questions. Noisy2 asked, talking about the Femo Center and Maskov Center, what do you mean by of center? And why is it a good thing that they're not equal? Like, why do you see that as a positive?
Yeah, good point. So of center basically just means, right, like this is a bit of gender theory 101, and so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but to answer the question, right, the notion of having simply men and women in the world, right, a binary gender dynamic where you have a male and a female, and that's all you can ever be, right, creates this literally binary, right, view. You have either, it's either a 1 or a 0, right? Like, I mean, literally, I think in there was some I don't think it was an not sure if it's an IETF standard, or there's some standard that literally describes, like, gender representation in database, and it's 1 for a male, a 0 for female, and they explicitly say, like, we don't mean to be any sort of, like, ranking system. It's just that's how, like, this binary field is decided to be stored. But the point is that that's not how people experience the world, and so the way to sort of add granularity to some of this, right, is to take that sort of binary notion of having 2 points, or, right, just one bit that you can flip, and then having it be instead a range, a scale, right, from, let's say, instead of, like, 0 to 1 and 0, right, 0 to 100 as an example. And so if in that schema, right, binary female is 0 and binary male is 100, right, then you have a center point 50, right, which is what you might have described before as androgynous, or as sort of bigendered, right, or some other sort of mix of the two. And so the idea is that there is a that's the point from which we measure the sort of, like, relationship back to binary gender. And as you saw, I think in the slide, I can go back to it even, right? We basically were like, this is a guess. We didn't actually ask people, right? This is sort of a sort of a relatively, admittedly, like, imperfect and somewhat problematic, right? Like, representation of what we assumed based on people's their own sort of, like, presented behaviors and such. The reason why it's good that it's not Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's what I was just going to ask about. Why do you see this as positive?
Right, yeah, and so the reason we see this as positive is because the specific goal of TLC, right, is to affect change in the status quo. So if you imagine, so the status quo right now is effectively flipped, right? Most companies in most technology positions, right, from most companies have primarily men or people who are masculine of center, right, in those roles. That is then replicated in all the schools that we're aware of, right? I mean, look at the whole STEM, thing and so on. And so by seeing this breakdown be the opposite of the status quo, to us, that signals that we are actually making inroads to the progress we want to see. And so we want this as skewed as possible with that respect, without necessarily like it's not like, there's a course for femme of center people and a course for masc of center people, because the material is the same. But seeing this skew this way tells us that we're reaching the right people, and that which is to say the people who are not reached elsewhere, right? And that we're providing that avenue for people who don't have as perhaps a safe or comfortable or just useful way of going about learning these things in existing paradigms through another alternative, if that makes sense.
Okay, Jack Hill, and I'm almost, thank you so much for asking the question, Jack Hill. I'm also interested. How would one boost a new TLC organization, especially with the heavy emphasis on relationships with other organizations and alumni?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So it's not so much that we are hoping to create a bunch of TLCs. Although if you wanted to, that would be more than welcome, right? Like the more people who are teaching this, the better. It's more that what we see our role as is providing a sort of anchor point, right? If you imagine this as a literal flywheel, then that center stick, right, that holds the flywheel together, that provides that anchor, is also a piece of the puzzle that you need. And so we are hoping instead what we are hoping to do is to inspire people to do projects around their abilities that they find important for their local communities, and to have and we want particularly the people who are doing those, people who would not have otherwise approached those projects with, for example, the notion of, oh, I can self-host this particular service, or, oh, for example, I can create a service that is, relevant to the 10,000 people in my neighborhood as opposed to the 10 million people in my country, right? There's a lot of focus on scale as a marker of success. And what we're hoping to do is get people to think of success not in the form of, I've started a company that now serves 10 billion people. I guess 10 million people, there aren't 10 billion people yet, but rather a marker of success being my life is now better, and my spouse's life is better, and my family's life is better in some material way. I have more time, I have more money, I have more ability to affect change in my local city council, that kind of thing, because I have more data to do it with, or I've presented, information that I got, from open data sources and this kind of stuff, using tools that perhaps we learned at TLC, like web scraping and so on, right? That's the goal. That being said, if you like what we're doing and you want to try it out too, do it. Like we're not in any way precious about that. But it does take a lot of existing relationships. It was specifically the affinity group that started around the 2015, 2016 sort of digital security stuff that began this particular iteration of TLC. I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
I think so. Seemed to me, at least. DLib asks, where do your first cohorts come from? I assume that's asking about first-time attenders.
Yeah, I guess that could be. There might be two questions in there. I'll answer both because I think both are interesting, right? So back to the sort of like the slides around like what are some people saying. What we actually find is that a lot of people coming to TLC are people who, for example, have some touch point with technology education, but have found it wanting. And that actually means that we have a lot of people signing up for workshops who are either sort of working in nonprofits or have taken sort of example, maybe they've gone to a crypto party, for instance, right? But they didn't really do much after the crypto party, right? So they kind of learned about PGP and GPG, but then they didn't actually implement it. And so they come to one of our GPG workshops, right, to see it from another perspective. Or, for example, they've gone to a code bootcamp. Actually, a lot of our workshop attendees were people who have gone through a code boot camp and found themselves still unsure about the fundamentals of like what a computer is and why they would be interested in it and where did all this thing come from and like why is Ethernet called Ethernet, right? Like in our description we talked about like why is Ethernet, like what is the Gnostic influence of Ethernet, right? And if you think about it, if you go back in time to the notion of the ether, right? The notion of the ether was this Gnostic superstition about a permeating force that connected all things, very much like the Force in like Star Wars or something. And so when Bob Metcalfe was creating Ethernet, right, like that naming choice was important because he wanted to create a link layer networking protocol that would connect all digital things. And so he called it the Ether net, right? And so now we have Ethernet. And that's what that is, right? And so again, having that sort of like foundational understanding is not something that you get quite as I think a lot of people would hope for instance, a CCNA course, right? Because you're basically getting pelted with a lot of facts, and if you can memorize them, that's great. But that's a much harder thing to do for humans because we're story based, and we like to connect things to metaphor and ideology and emotion, right, and sense. And so that's how we approach this the pedagogy itself, which is different. So a lot of people are people who have come from places where they would otherwise have been. They know that they know that this stuff exists, but they also know that they don't actually know it as well as they'd like. So that's sort of the first question that could have been answered by that. The second question I think was maybe in there was how did we start out, right? Like what was the first cohort for us? Do you know what I mean? And the short there's an about page on our website, which I'll point you to, techlearningcollective.com/about, which talks about this a little bit. But the short answer to that question is basically we were a mutual self-education group that started in a bunch of anarchist occupied spaces in New York City shortly before the 2016 presidential election. Somewhat involved with a number of different groups. And so a lot of us have sort of deep history with the activist left and decided that we just needed to be particularly good at this stuff. Some of us had more experience than others. And so what that meant was that we started basically a semi-private education group. And over the course of several years, having done several projects, what we've discovered is that there is actually a repeatable way of sort of presenting this material and learning this material that is much more likely to result in the kind of skill that we'd hope our comrades to have than, for example, learning through the black hole of videos, or reading Wikipedia articles, or going through existing courses that are primarily geared towards employability as opposed to bluntly competency.
Okay, 8 minutes left. Let me see,
Oh,
where was it?
time flies.
Decentralize. Yeah. Decentralize asks, with the proliferation of, quote, free services like Signal Chats, Google Docs, etc., do you spend time on explaining why those things are not ideal before you can get into the, okay, let's fire up our own community server to do this?
That's a great question. Yeah, the short answer is we do, but the longer answer is that it's not a distinct topic, right? We don't present free software as an alternative to anything. What we present it as is simply the best option that we currently have. And the reason for that is because it is the best option that we currently have. I don't think I need to tell this audience that thing. But the other reason for that is because by starting there, right, what we start with is a baseline that is always available regardless of what you are, like I can walk up to any computer in the world, and as long as it's running a free software operating system, right, where I have access to a command line on the internet, I know what to do, and I can also then make use of that computer, that machine, right? That is not possible if I have to ask for permission anywhere else, right? And so, like again, that metaphor that we put in the description, which is, what good is your pen if the paper that you're writing it like can refuse to show its ink, right? If you are beholden to anybody else at any point, right, then you don't actually have the level of autonomy that you need to do the things that we want to see done. And so we start with free software because if you don't have anywhere to start at all, then why not start with free software? Someone who is Maria, who's speaking just before us, right, we're saying about like, why not, learn, the GNU image manipulation program instead of Photoshop? And our point is, yeah, if you don't know how to use Photoshop, then what's the difference, right? You might as well start with the free software thing, and you'll be better off for it for many, many, many reasons. Does that make sense?
And to the question, if someone has followed the boot flow focusing on deployment, how does TLC help reestablish the foundations?
That's also a great question. So mostly what that happens, right, what happens is that a lot of people who have come from boot camps tend to sort of ignore our sort of 101 or introductory things. And then what they do is they end up coming to a course that's somewhat more intermediate, and they realize how over their head, over their head, a lot of stuff has gone, right? And so that's when they tend to be like, oh, wait a second, what came before this, right? What am I missing here? And then they sort of jump back to some of the earlier topics. In part because like when we start talking about computers, we don't start our conversations with bits and bytes per se. We like, for example, we have a workshop called Taming Daemons, which is our introduction to system administration workshop. And we don't start talking about computers as machines. We talk about computers as their what is their purpose? Like, why are they here? Right. And for us, that means that we actually start talking about it as a writing instrument, right? When you write, when you press a key on your keyboard, K, L, whatever, right? H, G, whatever, or another language if you have a different keyboard, what you are actually doing is inscribing, right, into silicon using a medium, in this case, electricity, right? Some physical artifact. That's a change in the physical world. Exactly like, leaving a lead mark on paper is a physical change. So you're actually physically leaving your mark somewhere. You're just writing with a different medium. And so the question as system administrators that we should be thinking about, right, is how much do we want to write? How much space will that take? How quickly can we write it, right? And even before we even talk about computers, you can immediately see the parallel to things like RAM and hard disk size, right? And so that's where we start. And so those are the kind of things we talk about when we talk about fundamentals, because when you start talking about it in that way, what you end up with is the possibility of affecting sort of this transfer of skill across things that are not even computer related. And so it's much more about teaching as much of a philosophy, which is why we call it apprenticeship based in part, as it is a specific technical skill, if that makes any sense.
With just 3 minutes left, so this might be our last question.
Okay.
How might the support of ecology and environment fit into that flywheel mechanic for TLC?
So support of ecology. I think I need a little bit of clarification about what that means. Do you mean like sustainable infrastructure, like solar power, ARM chips and this kind of stuff, or?
That was my assumption from the structure of the question.
Yeah, I mean, for us, that's sort of like, I mean, in this sort of simplistic diagram, that would sort of partly be free software, right? Like we need open hardware, open software. We need to be able to actually have freely accessible designs for all these things, and of course, all of this is underpinned by like the need to power it, right? So that we actually have to have some energy to power the devices that we're using for this, and that's also, of course, another problem. Not to be glib, but that's a little bit outside of the scope of what we're trying to do, in part because we see ourselves as trying to start this process. But that doesn't mean, right, that people who are part of our alumni community don't find that interesting. In fact, we were just talking before the live stream started that there's another sort of a collection of alumni, I'll say, in a group called the Solarpunk Magic Computer Club that has, you can look it up. I think you can just do any internet search. We'll find the Solarpunk Magic Computer Club. And they talk a lot about that kind of more literally interweaving of sustainable, ecologically sound principles with modern technology. So that, for example, we're not using Python primarily or only, right, to attack Microsoft Exchange servers, but we're using it to, for example, be partly responsible for helping us grow basil that we're going to then use in our pasta, because that's how the flower pot works. It has Python code that we can hack on, that we can modify, because it's all free software, that kind of thing. And so that's very, very fun, very cool. And again, it has come out of, right, a number of people who have taken classes and courses with TLC to get a baseline understanding of a technology that is not inherently then immediately funneling them into a metaphor of, for example, the skeuomorphic, desktop that we have on a computer, right? Like we're all using desktop environments, but if you look at a laptop, there's no desk in it. You know what I mean? Like, this is not a desktop. It's on a desk, but there's no desk in the laptop. So what is that desktop actually? It's a metaphor. And if you start understanding that it's a metaphor, then you can start imagining what else you can do with computers, because you begin to use different metaphors to interact and think about what the computer actually is for you.
Thank you so much. That is our time.
Okay, thank you so much for having us at LibrePlanet, and thanks to the FSF and for you to helping with the slides earlier. We hope everyone will check out techlearningcollective.com. Send us check out the contact page. There's an email address there, and we have a PGP key as well that you can use if you want slightly more private communication. There's even an Onion site that we mirror our website to. So thanks for coming, and change the world with us.